like to welcome everyone to our session tonight. Just a little intro of me. I'm Phil Woolery. I'm with the Indiana Forestry and Woodland Owners Association, and a little bit about ourselves. We're is an organization that's dedicated to the conservation and sustainable management of woodlands in Indiana. So um, if you're interested in our organization, I'll drop the link to our website in there. But tonight we have Ed Oehlman joining us, and he's with, not sure exactly, a bunch of different organizations. So American Bird Conservancy, but he's the Southern Indiana um, Birdscape coordinator, or yeah, right, yeah, and so he's working on habitat for a cerulean warbler. So I will turn it over to Ed. And I think if you have questions, we'll try and do those at the end, but you can put them in the chat, and we can work through them at the end. So I'll turn it all over to Ed now.
How about that? We good now? All right. Phil, can you see my screen all right?
Yep, all good.
Perfect, perfect. Well, good evening, everybody. Excited to be here giving you guys this talk, or I guess be here. It's a webinar. Sorry. Instinct. But yeah, like Phil said, I got a lot of different titles and agencies, so it's a mouthful to try to say. But I'm Edward Oehlman. I'm the Southern Indiana Birdscape Coordinator, and I work for CHJV, which is part of ABC. CHJV is the Central Hardwood Joint Venture, part of the American Bird Conservancy. So we focus through the Central Hardwoods on forest management for birds or just bird conservation as a whole. Most of the time in the Central Hardwoods, that is forest management. But we do, have some grasslands, some marsh work and things like that. But we'll talk a little bit about birds. I'm going to talk a little bit about forest management for birds on a broad scale. And then I'm going to dive in a little bit on our birdscape and the Southern Indiana birdscape, just as a little bit more case-focused example of forest management for birds. And then, like Phil said, we'll close out with questions. If you have questions as we go, drop them in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it. If not, just throw your hand up and we can try and make sure that we get your questions answered. But otherwise, without further ado, uh, why does this matter? In the last 50 years, we've lost 55 years. We have lost 2.9 billion birds. That number has grown to about 3.1 billion at this point. But yeah, our bird populations are in steady decline across the board. And this is sad to see. Obviously, if anybody in this group has enjoys going out and seeing birds, you probably are already familiar with these numbers. But even if you're not somebody that necessarily goes out into the field for the sake of birds, next time you are out in nature, enjoying nature, I encourage you to take a minute and listen and hear for birds, look around for birds, and then assume what it would be like if, those weren't there. So it's an impactful stat to talk about, but going forward from that, though, one of the things I do like to emphasize is that we're losing our bird populations across the board in all different habitat types, with the only exception being our wetland birds, our waterfowl. Our waterfowl are the only ones that are seeing a percentage gain in the last 55 years, and that's in population percentage. But that really, I like to emphasize this for the opportunity to showcase that management and land management can have an impact on this. That stat right off the bat can be a little doom and gloom, but we do have the opportunity to change this. For the wetland birds in particularly, or waterfowl, this trajectory was changed mainly in part thanks to waterfowl hunters, Ducks Unlimited, and a lot of other partnering organizations that realized, hey, we're losing our duck populations drastically. We need to do something to change this. And they've put a lot of funds, raised a lot of money, done a lot of restoration work to change that, and they are on the up and up. So that's something I like to showcase, that there is a success story out there on how land management can impact these populations. Sadly, it's just not as broad as the doom and gloom negative commentary that can be made about these populations. Um, Moving on, one of the kind of key things I'm going to kind of review for you guys because I think it's a really great resource for landowners, and the Nature Conservancy in partnership with a lot of other organizations produce this product. Purdue Extension, I know ABC was involved, CHJV was involved, but this is a great publication for landowners to get a little bit more in depth beyond what I'll have the opportunity to talk about. And it's this Forestry for the Birds project. Uh, I essentially identified 12 key species that are on the declining side, that are key focus species. Some of them are even state listed. And then they took and focused on, okay, what is the forest structure that makes these species so important? What's that look like? How can we adjust this? I went ahead and threw a QR code on there so you guys can get access to the website that talks more about that, and then the PDF version of both those documents pictured. And I can loop back to this if you don't grab it now, but you can also just look up Nature Conservancy Indiana Forestry for the Birds. Really great publication. The pocket guide is just overview information, but the silviculture guide goes a lot more in depth on the forest management side of things. And they've even done a great job to connect the silviculture to some of the NRCS forest management practices. So if you wanted to talk to a forester or your local DC about trying to get land management done on your woodlot or your woodlands, that guide is really great to help with. So, but moving forward, I'm going to kind of talk about two pockets of birds in particular. So I'm going to talk about our mature forest birds, and then I'm going to jump over to talking about our young forest birds. The mature forest birds are, most of them focus on large tracts of mature forest. And when I say large tracts, they like expanses of forest. They're not the birds that you're going to find at your bird feeder. They're not really urban birds. Most of the time, these birds are needing some upwards of 20, 40 acre minimum to a square mile of contiguous forest to really find habitat that they're comfortable in. This is where I really want to emphasize, though, that mature forest doesn't mean, oh, hey, we have this nice, lush, dense forest like what's pictured here, where, it's very, very difficult to look through that image. But these forests are structures and they contain a diverse structure. I'm going to dive into this a little bit deeper when we get into the cerulean conversation, but they contain a diverse structure that's layered, and from the understory, the midstory, and the canopy, and how that structure is composed differs for how each bird needs based on its feeding habitat, based on its nesting structure, and all the aspects of that life's need. So these birds don't just need a mature forest, the structure within said forest. Not all houses are built the same, not all forests are built the same. The structure within each forest needs to cater to the birds. And that's where the forest management can really come into play, where we can take and edit the structure to meet the needs of birds. Most of the time, it's a thinning operation, it's opening up the understory, it's allowing more sunlight into the understory. But there is a subset of birds that, like ovenbird and some of the thrushes, that do still like that dense understory and midstory. Moving on to young forest birds. Oh, I just noticed my header's wrong. I apologize, folks. Young forest birds, these are our birds that need that opening, need that large opening, not just small canopy openings, but large openings, expanses. I'm talking of minimum of an acre to 2 acres and upwards of, 30, 40 acres in size is really great for some of these birds. They capitalize on having that very, very dense understory. And to achieve that kind of density, you have to have an absence of an overstory. Oftentimes, these birds also rely on hunting features that require that opening. If you're not familiar with eastern whippoorwill, it's a nocturnal species, predominantly nocturnal, and they're flying and they prefer to fly in that more open structure, but then they nest down in the dense understory. The same works for woodcock. If you've ever seen woodcock do their displays and their breeding displays, they need open airspace to do these little cartwheels, and they come back down onto the land and do this little dance. Very, very cute and intriguing. But these birds capitalize on having that very, very dense understory, and the only real way to achieve this kind of density is by a full clear-cut opening and then allowing that regeneration to take place. This habitat in particular is one of our the most missing habitat by percentage when we talk about forest structure in Indiana. We've aged our forest to a very mature structure that we don't have this on the landscape naturally as it once was. There was a time when, through natural events, whether that be weather events, tornadoes, straight line winds, things like that, or we also wildfire was all naturally on the landscape, also driven by natives were putting fire on the landscape. Any outbreaks to diseases or even insects. And then we also, in Indiana, historically, we had large mammals. So we had bison and elk and these large mammals that were going in and doing damage and disturbance to pockets of forest that were creating these openings. The other component that is oftentimes overlooked, but the is that all these systems play together and were, you know, grew upon each other. So you might have just a couple trees here and there that were impacted by disease or decline that allowed a little bit of sunlight that grew a small opening that created a vegetation flush that then introduced more mammals impacting that particular area, that then were rubbing against trees, creating a larger opening, and the things expanded larger and larger as they created more of an opening. These dense understory shelterwood openings also create habitat for a lot of our um, herps, our salamanders, box turtles, things like that. And then there's some key game species that also like this, and particularly wild turkey will take its poults in there. So this is beneficial beyond just our birds. And that's a key point I want to talk about later. There's a lot of forest management practices that we can utilize to mimic some of the natural processes that were on the landscape, like I've mentioned. There's also some forest management practices that are very influential and needed when we're talking about managing forests for birds. I'm going to go ahead and start by mentioning invasive species because that's kind of across the board. Most everybody is familiar with it, but also it's something that we really can't be doing without we can't really be doing much of the other forest management work without doing invasives first. If these other management work processes that I'm talking about, practices, release sunlight to the forest floor and we still have invasives presence, you have an explosion of invasives because they can outcompete the natives, and you create a larger problem long term. So, in this scenario here, or pictured the largest image there, there's two forest techs that are doing some invasive work. As you can see in this image, there is almost no understory at all. That is because this was a very much a closed canopy structure. You can see through the image to see it's a sun shining day, but yet inside the tree canopy, it's very sheltered out. There's no sunlight. Very closed canopy structure. There's no sunlight getting to the understory. The natives can't compete. The limited invasive pressure that's there, which was mainly honeysuckle in this image, can still hang on because it has a little bit of competition and can be mildly shade tolerant. if we would have done any overstory, young forest management, even done some burns, prescribed burn that might have killed any overstory, that would have definitely created a larger impact because any native seed that was in the soil bank still may have blossomed and may have sprouted, but the invasives was the dominant understory plant and had a higher chance of just exploding and creating a larger impact. So I like to use that image because it shows you, that's maybe an extreme case. I'd hope that most people don't have this closed of a canopy structure with that much void of an understory, but that's an important impact when it comes to managing invasives first and a primary objective. The next three things on my list there, snag retention or creation, young forest management, and mature forest management, are all, well, the young forest management and mature forest management are kind of components based on what your goal is and what your stand looks like currently. But the snag retention creation is a component that we can integrate into either one of these practices. The snag retention or creation is straightforward in that it's just the deadening of stems, retaining a standing dead tree that most of the time it's just the bole of the log. Eventually the top will snap out. And the main focus there is that it draws insects, and then insects are the food source for so many of our birds, and then we'll draw birds, and particularly our woodpeckers. A lot of woodpeckers will key in on heavy snag forests or heavy snag blocks because there is an abundance of food source there. That also then can go the next step in saying, as the woodpeckers create cavities, they then will nest in these cavities. They vacate the cavities. They rarely nest in cavities more than once. And then we have a whole nother subset of species that are cavity nesters, but not cavity creators. And so we have other songbirds, tropical migrants that then will move into these snags and nest in the cavities that were previously created. So we're creating structure, we're creating homes, habitat for these birds in multiple scales, multiple levels. But the young forest management is what I've already kind of touched on, where we're creating larger openings. This is where we are doing most of the time being done through harvesting, but we're creating large openings, harvesting all the overstory, and then allowing for the natural reestablishment of seeds and retaining those seedlings. It's best to do the young forest management when you already have a decent seed bed present. Um, so at times you might do a light thinning to get some sunlight first and then release the rest of the overstory. But it's all based on, it's very case specific on what your stand is, stage your stand is in currently. The mature forest management is usually done on a very similarly, but on a lot smaller scale, where we're only going to be doing small openings, less than a half an acre. We're just taking a couple stems, just allowing the sunlight to come in filtered. So from a canopy structure, if this image was 100% closed canopy, the young forest, we're going down to 20% or less. So, and most of the time, even 0% canopy. So there is no overstory canopy. In a mature forest management, we're going to be dropping down to maybe 70%, but most of the time you're hanging around like the 80% canopy. So you're allowing the light to filter into the understory so we can create some structure and some habitat, but we still need to maintain an overstory canopy. A lot of times those species are overstory nesting birds that need that canopy. They're nesting up in canopies. So prescribed fire is something that some states are a lot further along in their implementation and use of prescribed fire as a forest management tool. But in recent years, Indiana has been putting more and more focus into trying to get it on the landscape, as it was naturally here originally and had been used by natives for, hundreds and thousands of years since. But the prescribed fire, what it's allowing you to do is help regenerate that understory, kind of revitalize, but also it's going to help thin out our non-fire tolerant species. So we have species such as oak and hickory that can be fire tolerant just by their bark, but also oak in particular, you can top kill and it will resprout from its roots a lot better than some of our non-fire tolerant species such as beech and maple. They have a lot thinner bark, so they will blister more and die off as, when they're younger trees. And when I say young trees, 7 inches or smaller, oftentimes is about the max that a fire can kill. But fire can do damage to full, mature, overstory trees. But what the fires are going to allow you to do is help rejuvenate that understory, kill off some of the shade tolerant species, and allow some of the fire tolerant species to flourish. In particular, Indiana, most of the time is our oaks, like I've mentioned, and just allow a more efficient management than trying to go in there and doing it mechanically um, or using herbicides or other chemicals. And one of the key things I always like to close with is continued maintenance. This is more like mowing your yard, not like, I don't know, putting up a mailbox. Where you do, just because you did the task once doesn't mean, okay, we're all done with our forest management. We never have to touch it again. There is some things that you need to be continually doing. I don't say like you're out there every week, but you need to be monitoring, especially when it comes to invasives. If you can stay on top of invasives and routine monitoring to see where invasives might be presenting themselves and treating them when they are young, you have a better chance of having continued health than, walking away from it and coming back 5 years later and then all suddenly, oh wait, we had these invasives pop and now we're trying to treat a large tract. But that's always a good, important thing. Plus, it's, I don't know. I feel like most landowners, you don't own forests just passively say, "Oh yeah, that's a block of trees." It's kind of fun to go out and watch how things are growing and progressing, and get to know your woods and have that continued inspection, continued monitoring, continued maintenance. So that was kind of the 40,000 foot view of the forest management. It's hard to get too in depth since so much forest management is done on a case by case basis. And also, every landowner's forest is at a different stage, or every landowner's objective is at a different stage. But that kind of, my hope was that gave you an overview of some of the conversations or some of the things to be thinking about. And I always encourage people to have a conversation with a professional forester, and talk about doing forest management, or even talking to your local NRCS office, your DCs, about what potentials might be out there and how best to serve the habitat to meet the needs of birds and other mammals or herps that you might be interested in. I'm going to now kind of shift a little bit and talk in particular about cerulean warbler. This is the bird and the forest management work that I spent all my time working on. And I think it gives you a little bit more in depth without trying to go through all the potential cases that might be out there from forest management. So in particularly, I'm focusing on cerulean warbler, going back to my stat about how all birds have declined in the last 50 years. My main focus on cerulean warbler is because we've lost about 70% of their population in the last 50 years. So we've had a serious decline. In particular, where we roughly estimate that there's about 500,000 species. This bird is kind of unique because, well, if you're not familiar with the term neotropical migrant, what that means is that it migrates across the tropics. Um, the map on the left there shows the orange, which is its breeding season grounds, where it spends its summer. The yellow is where it migrates through, and the blue is where it spends its winter. So it's wintering down in the Andes Mountains in Colombia mainly, but yet it's summering up in Indiana and the Midwest hardwoods. This bird was at one time considered to be very prevalent throughout Indiana. There's a few different records that talk about it being perhaps the most common forest bird. But yet now, if you're a birder or if you talk to a birder and ask them about opportunities to go see cerulean warbler, a lot of times they're gonna be like, "Oh, give you about two or three options in the state where you can almost guarantee a sighting, but otherwise, very minimal opportunities." The map on the right there is the purple shading. It shows where they're present today or as of the last 5 years through their summer breeding season. So the darker purple is where the populations are larger or denser, and the lighter purple is where the populations are less dense. Where there is no purple, there is no presence or no significant presence. So you can see that there's a pretty good void to a lot of Indiana, mainly up in the ag area. That's because predominantly because this bird, cerulean warbler, focuses on contiguous forest. So to zoom in a little bit more on Indiana, the main areas where cerulean warbler focuses is where you have about a square mile or larger of contiguous forest. So when you overlay the mean seasonal abundance of cerulean warbler for Indiana with our forested acreage or forested land cover, you'll see some correlations clearly presenting themselves. If you're familiar with Brown County and the Brown County area, you can see that that presence is dominated in the areas where Yellowwood State Forest and Yellowwood State Forest, Morgan Monroe, the Hoosier, Brown County State Park. If you look at some of the other shaded areas, we start picking up some other properties. Between Jennings and Ripley County is Big Oaks Fish and Wildlife. The northern part of Martin County, where you also see some density, that's Crane Naval Base. And then that whole belt of the Forest Service going on down to the river, you can clearly see annotated by its presence. Um, that's kind of showcasing, the need for the contiguous forest. But more importantly, one of the really things that the cerulean warbler keys in on and is kind of what's caused or is science is suggesting is what caused the decline is the structure of our forests. So as our forests have grown in the last 50 years, we are not managing like we were up and through to the 70s. In the 70s, we were doing a lot more aggressive logging. I'm not necessarily saying that all the management and logging we were doing on the landscape up through the 70s was had the best conservation ethics in place. We were resetting the structure and allowing for a lot of young forest. And through some of the single tree selection that was popular then, we are allowing for these openings to be formed. Cerulean warbler in particular likes these small canopy openings of about half an acre in size or smaller, and especially they key in on white oak trees or any trees in the white oak family that are adjacent to these openings. They prefer to nest in white oak canopies that range 60 to 75 feet off the ground, adjacent to these openings. But one of the key details they like is a void of a mid-story. Kind of modeled in this drawing, you see there's not much of any density in the mid-story, but you regain density again in the understory. Cerulean warblers are exclusively um, caterpillar eaters, and they mainly feed in that understory, that dense understory vegetation. So they will nest in that high canopy, drop into that understory to feed, and then work their way back up to the overstory. They really prefer ridge lines and topographical structure. We think that that's in part due to the nature of wanting that overstory tree that reaches out over top of an opening, and the topography helps lend to that type of structure to be created in the canopy, the as it's magnified up to it. I've already mentioned they really key in a lot of white oak species, but in particular, they dominate in the white oak itself, Quercus alba. Um, the management that objectives that we're really focusing on as we're trying to create habitat for cerulean warblers to try to curb the population decline that we're seeing is by taking and finding these forested lands in Brown County or in the existing cerulean warbler populations and creating small openings in the canopy, especially when there's places where the white oak is already present, and positioning these openings adjacent to the white oak. And then in addition to this, we're also doing FSI, forest and TSI, timber stand improvement, where you're going in and cleaning out all the mid-story and allowing more sunlight to reach the understory. And with almost all of our management plans, we're also including fire as an additional management tool in there to help thin any mid-story that was left and help rejuvenate that understory even more. So the last thing I always like to close by saying is what I've kind of already hit on a few times, but this habitat management work, whether you're focusing it on mature forest birds or young forest birds, any particular forest species that you really key in on or are interested in, we can't always guarantee, at least we always try to think about this ourselves with the birds, the cerulean warbler birdscape, is that we can't guarantee that the work we're doing will benefit cerulean. If you create a certain structure to benefit woodpeckers and you create a lot of snags, you can't guarantee that the woodpeckers will present themselves. We don't have a crystal ball, we can't control the birds, but most of the time, 9 times out of 10, there are also other species that will be benefiting from this work as well, beyond just the key birds that you're focusing on. And not just on birds, but also bats, other mammals, large mammals, small mammals, and then, all of our herps, our turtles, our salamanders, snakes, and other critters. So it's an important management process that needs to be done beyond just letting the forest sit idle and grow. And it's important for the health of the trees, but most importantly for our wildlife. So, and as a passive resource for all of those in attendance, I also like to show some points that might be beneficial for you if you're interested in birds and bird identification. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology from Cornell University has a whole suite of really great tools. Their eBird is it's kind of like the golden goose when it comes to birding and bird records. It's kind of a citizen science project that allows individuals to submit lists of the birds they have seen and their location, their time, things like that. We ourselves with CHJV and a lot of ABC employees, American Bird Conservancy employees, use the eBird data as a starting point for a lot of our research. There's a lot of research that goes on at a lot of universities where they use eBird data for some of extrapolation work. The other tool that is very common is Merlin. Merlin can be used in two ways. It's the image of the owl here, and I tried to use a screenshot from a cell phone, so it's the view that you would normally see. But it has a recording feature where you can put it to record, and then your phone will listen and to whatever calls it's hearing, and can usually identify it with pretty decent certainty. It depends on the rarity or the commonality of the bird. And a key component to that is making sure that you have your location settings available. Um, I always have to give the disclaimer that Merlin is using computer-based learning and AI to monitor this. So just because Merlin says that you heard this ultra rare bird does not mean that you might truly have it there. It's always best to then cross-reference and verify. Don't take Merlin for at its word all the time. We've spent plenty of time trying to trick Merlin. As birders, we oftentimes like to play games to see if we can convince Merlin that you're something other than what you are. And then additionally, there's an aspect to Merlin where you are listening and it can collect that data, but it is not forwarding that data to anybody else. So if you really want to be involved in the citizen science aspect of it and sharing your bird identification, you still need to have eBird and create lists. So oftentimes people think that there's some back communication, but there is not. The other feature that Merlin does really well with is the step-by-step guide, and it goes through a process of question and asks you, based on size and shape and colors and the habitat it was present in, and helps you key down to a list of potential birds that you had to help you identify that. I think it's a really great tool for those that are really interested in learning more about the birds that they have in their forest and getting to know more about the habitat and structure they have. The Audubon also has two in Indiana. Audubon, Indiana has two really great resources. The first one is just your local chapters are great for meeting other people that know more about birds or know a lot about birds. And it's also a great resource to connect with just for the sake of supporting bird conservation. Audubon, Indiana also has a really great Discord channel. If you're not familiar with Discord, it's a social networking platform where you can share bird sightings, but in particular, they do have a bird ID or general questions channel that you can talk about or ask or have engaging conversations with others throughout Indiana. And then the last thing, I'll bring it back to the TNC Forestry for the Birds Pocket Guide and Silviculture Guide that I mentioned earlier. Both of those are Indiana specific and really give a lot of information for forest landowners and key in on some different individual structures. Um, with that being said, I wanted to try and make sure we leave plenty of time for questions, as I'm sure you guys have some good, intriguing questions. But I do have my contact information up there. So if anybody has questions that either they think would be better presented via email or have a more expansive discussion, I'm always happy to receive emails and engage through that.
All right. Thank you, Ed. So, if you have questions for Ed, you can put them in the chat or I guess raise your hand. I'll start out. Um, so are all trees equal? Like we talked about making structure. Like if we get the openings and what if we have just openings and we have, as opposed to we have white oak trees, we got sugar maple trees around. How does that affect the birds?
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. So Um, in short, the answer is no. No, all trees are not equal. But there's certain birds that key in on certain species, and it's based on the habitat and their habitat needs. So you got to remember that these trees are not just a passive part of the habitat. These trees are their structure, similar to how buildings are for us. These trees are their food source just like how all the different aspects of the grocery store are our food source. And, similar to how we have different parts of our house, whether it's a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and we have different spaces that we have to use for different needs, we also have different foods that are needed for fats and sugars and proteins. And these birds are needing to key in on different tree species depending on what resource they're needing. So while I mentioned cerulean warbler really keys on white oak, um, and another species that cerulean warbler needs is grapevine. It really uses almost exclusively the bark from grapevine for its nesting material while other birds exist that really need the softer wood to cavity and den into. The bark of shagbark hickories is a very, picturesque thing. I think most people can identify shagbark hickories because of that key detail. That's an important thing for birds for being able to feed. There's some birds can only eat seeds by sticking it into the bark and working on digesting that seed. So no, all trees are not equal. Um, Inherently, because our natural ecosystem was so dominated by oak and hickory, there's a push towards oak and hickory, and oftentimes there's a pushback that comes from, oh, well, oak and hickory are also higher in monetary value, and that's why foresters encourage that. But with that being a native species that was more dominant, we have more of an interest in those species from our native bird populations. So I know that was a little long-winded way to answer your question, Phil, but I hope that gave a little more insight.
Yep, that's good. Looks like we got a couple in the chat here. So
Okay. Well, unless you
I'll
want to.
I'll read them for you. So
Okay.
all right. So how many acres do you need to manage in order to make a difference for birds? So if you have 20 to 30 acres to manage, is there a benefit in having different structures or habitat types adjacent to each other, even if they are relatively small areas?
So there's kind of like two-part question there. I'll start with the first one because it's kind of the easiest. I don't think there's really a minimum needed on how many acres you need in order to manage to make a difference for birds. Even just having a quality backyard can make a difference for birds. Um, Birds, especially when they're migrating, need a lot of sugars. They need a lot of fats to be able to make the migration. And so having a food source that can generate those fats, whether it's berries or whatever is present there, is important. But the other aspect to that is they need water sources. They need structures where they can come down and feel protected. So vegetation densities, things like that. There's a lot of great resources that you can find out there. I think Purdue even had a publication on, managing your backyards for birds. So there's not really a minimum needed. Now, if we're talking about forest structures in particular, um, if you're trying to diversify and create multiple habitats, I think there's kind of an inflection point that is generated probably around the 20 to 30, somewhere between like 20 and 40 acres, that we can start looking at diversifying the habitat within. A lot of times that's referred to as a mosaic, where you're creating small openings here, creating larger openings over there, and allowing for a multitude of habitat structures within an individual stand. I think that before you kind of start thinking about trying to create multiple habitats within your stand, a better thing is to look at it from a landscape. If you yourself are managing 300 acres, 500 acres, yes, you have probably more opportunity for that. But if you're looking at 20 to 30 acres, like the question asked, that's when maybe it's better to think about, okay, what can I do really well on my 20 to 30 acres? Or maybe what do the birds really need in this area? Does your neighbor already have a really large opening? Maybe that's where you need to have some of the smaller openings, or maybe there is no openings in the surrounding area, and the best option is to do a larger clear cut or a shelter wood opening. So,
All right. And then I guess building off that, I think important. Can you talk about like importance, like kind of working with what you have? Like if your forest, like if your forest is like a bottomland forest, you probably shouldn't be. You wouldn't want to manage for like oak hickory,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. So that's where I think that a lot of times, back to my comment about talking with a forester and engaging with, a professional forester can be very beneficial. But it's not a requirement. But yeah, analyzing the habitat that you have existing is kind of what you're getting at there, Phil. And it's important to try and move towards what would have natively fit. We wouldn't try and create a wet floodplain forest on the top of a ridge. Inversely, you wouldn't try to manage for dry site species in a floodplain. Um, I think a great example of that, and maybe a little bit more extreme example, is that a lot of times I hear of in southern Indiana where people try to do large prairie plantings, and then they resort to spending a lot of efforts to mitigate the trees that are growing in their large prairie plantings, but they're working in areas where the habitat naturally wants to be forest and historically was forest. So if we try to go against nature, it creates a lot more work than if we just, you know, really pay attention to what the native habitat wants to be on that landscape and work towards that.
All right, we got another question about shrubs. So, what are the best native shrubs to plant for food and habitat for birds? Seems like invasives are appealing to birds like autumn olive and pear. Are these actually harmful to birds, or is it simply issue they take over and create a monoculture?
Yeah. So absolutely. Invasives do at times seem to be appealing to birds. In particularly, if you've experienced honeysuckle in the fall, you'll see the little red berries. And it's a natural food source that's there for birds to want to go after. Most of the time, berries are this bright color. The plant has evolved to be a bright color, so that way the birds can find them easier, can spread and deliver the seed elsewhere. Plants can't migrate like birds do, but they can piggyback on birds. So there is that inherent food source present when the invasives are present. However, it can be detrimental to the birds, in particularly the example I just gave about honeysuckle and in the fall and migrating birds. It's very high on in sugars, but has no caloric intake. So it's like giving your kid a icy or a whole sugary drink and then telling them, okay, we're going to go and run a mile now, or we're going to go do a whole day's worth of activity at the zoo. At some point, they're going to crash and lose that momentum that they had as opposed to eating a good, healthy breakfast that has the fats and nutrition that they're going to make it through their day. So if these birds, especially in Indiana, are filling up on these high sugar honeysuckle berries that don't have the caloric intake, they're not storing up the fats and the fat reserves that they're going to need to be able to make the full migration back to their wintering grounds, whether that's Central America or South America. So they can be detrimental to the the presence and overpresence of invasives can be detrimental to our birds. I'm sorry, there was a couple other parts to that question. I'm trying to catch up here. But yeah, so that's kind of what I was talking about the harmfulness to birds. But yes, you are correct in that these can also just be an issue from the monoculture that they create in the understory. They are very good at shading out the native plants. Most of the time, our invasive species also have a jump start on our native plants where they will start to green up a week or two before our native plants. So, I encourage you to be looking out on your landscape here in the coming week and the next couple weeks. You're going to see that you're going to start seeing greening in the forests as you drive by them. And if you stop and go and look, you're going to find that most of the time where you're seeing vegetation already greening up, it's going to be our invasives and it's not going to be the native plants. And then the same goes for the fall. They have an extra couple weeks. So their growing season is almost a month longer than our native plants, giving them that opportunity to grow larger, get a head start, and get a more robust structure to outcompete the natives. Um, and then your question about what are some of the best native shrubs to plant for food and habitat for birds. This again is a tough question because it's site specific. So, the plants that we're going to encourage for a bottomland site, for example, a big one is buttonbush. Buttonbush is great along some of our marshes and bottomland, and the seed head is a good use for some different warblers. Prothonotary warbler loves buttonbush when it's gone to seed. But then there's other, upland site species. We have native blueberries that a lot of warblers will also look at, or other ground feeding birds will go in and feed in. But so it's dependent on the habitat you're working on. I'm going to take a second to do a little bit of a shout out to the Indiana Native Plant Society. They have a really great online plant finder, and it works kind of like a dichotomous key in structure where you can take and key in information, whether you have a high light, low light, high moisture, low moisture, the type of season, the type of color you're looking for, and it will help you find a native plant that meets the needs of what you're going after. This is especially beneficial for when I go back to talking about managing small properties or even your backyard for birds or habitat, because you can incorporate those native plants into your landscaping and still get the flowering and the colors and the structures that you need. Um, I hope that answered that question in full. There's a couple, multiple parts to it, so.
Yeah, I just put in the link in the chat to that plant finder there. And then we also had to mention the about the insects you had talked about before, like insects there, but with our invasive species, non-native, they don't support a lot of insect species that are important for birds.
Correct, correct. And that goes back to something I kind of mentioned about how, these plants, these insects, these birds, these mammals, the whole habitat evolved together. And so when there's an overpresence of something that is disturbing the hierarchy, you create an imbalance. So if the understory that hosts so many of our native insects isn't present, therefore, our native insects can't be present. And if they aren't there, then we start losing the birds that need to be there. And it just kind of grows and compounds as you move down the food chain. So thinking back to our second grade food chain days.
All right. So I guess as part of the working with either cerulean warblers, what are kind of some specific things, goals, and everything this whole project that you will be working on here in Indiana?
Yeah, so in particular for the cerulean warbler, I kind of mentioned some of the forest management aspects, but for the birdscape project as a whole, we have some different sub teams that are keying in. Our mission, our mission statement is to curb the decline, the population decline in cerulean warblers. So, we're not necessarily going after trying to grow the population. We hope that we can do that eventually, but right now we need to slow the rapid rate that we're seeing, because otherwise, we could speculate that in 10, 15 years, we might not have a cerulean warbler on Indiana's landscape. So our main focus is curbing that decline. Along those lines, we have some of the longest ongoing research on cerulean warblers is done on the Harvard Ecosystem Experiment in Yellowwood State Forest. But we still don't know a ton about that bird. It's a very small bird. It weighs about the same as 2 nickels. So next time you get change from the cashier, if there's nickels in your hand, think about this bird that flies all the way to Columbia and only weighs as much as 2 nickels. Um, but it's a very small bird. Like I said, it spends most of its time up in the canopies, so there's never been a ton of research done on it. So we have a whole team that's dedicated to the researching aspect, their migration, there's key stopover habitats in Central America and what we need to be doing to help support them there, and then their key wintering grounds in South America and how we can support them there. So, it's not a single stand level project. It's not a landscape level project. It's an international level project, because we do have partners in Colombia that are working on the grounds there. We have recently made some acquisitions in Costa Rica that were very pivotal stopover habitats, and we are growing the habitat management that we're doing in central Indiana, southern Indiana. We have some other sub teams that are also working on trying to just do some general outreach and education, getting information out there. A lot of people, see the cerulean warbler. It's my background on my screen, and they've never seen it before or even heard of it. Um, and then we even have our policy team that's kind of working on more of a general understanding or outreach to our lawmakers. We live in an era where change isn't made if you don't incorporate a government. But we're also working on trying to land. We're going after about a $20 million opportunity to get funds to help with private land management. That'll go through NRCS and help fund landowners to do forest management on their property through NRCS, similar to EQIP, but it's a second pot of money to help fund some of the EQIP practices. But yeah, we have a whole suite of sub teams beyond just some of the demonstration work that we're doing and some of the active forest management we're conducting.
All right, that sounds great. Some exciting work getting done here to help our native birds. And I suppose like we benefit cerulean warblers, but I'm sure a lot of other birds will benefit along with them too.
Yes, I always like to say that for every cerulean we save, we have a lot of collateral gain. I don't know if we've necessarily, saving every individual, but that's kind of my go-to.
Yeah. All right. If we don't have any other questions, I think we'll end it here tonight. Thank you everyone for joining.